Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's my pleasure to have you all at the Festive Tech Calendar 2024. My name is Siddharth Maurya, and I will be talking to you today and presenting to all of you about securing Microsoft Fabric in the traditional way. Keeping in line with the traditions of Christmas, I want to discuss how we typically secure workloads on Azure and how do you traditionally do it, and then what are the new ways. And I want to dive into some of the traditional ways that I personally like a lot in my configurations with my customers. But first, a little bit about myself. Like I mentioned, my name is Siddharth Warrior, but I'm also known as Sid. I am a cloud infrastructure architect in the Azure space. I have a communication networks background. I've done my Master of Engineering in electrical and computer science engineering from the University of Toronto. Um, so that got me really into understanding on-prem networks and also the cloud networking, and that's what got me to do the Azure Network Engineer Associate. And then I also picked up the administrator, the virtual desktop specialty, and finally the DevOps engineer expert as well. You'll find me working on a lot of Azure core solutions. So I typically work on setting up enterprise data platforms. So create the infrastructure, protect it, secure it, make it efficient, and then hand it over to the data teams, to the data engineering teams. But also, I work with server migrations, lift and shift migrations from on-prem to the cloud, or even from AWS to Azure. I am specialized in the cloud network engineering space, so I like to set up hybrid networks, side-to-side VPNs, point-to-side VPNs, DNS private resolver for private resource resolution as well. Okay, so let's talk about today's agenda. Um, so we will briefly touch upon what is Microsoft Fabric, right? I'm sure everyone already knows this, must be hearing a lot about it, but just a brief touch into it. Um, we'll go into what are the traditional ways of securing workloads on Azure. Um, Most of it is related to setting up private endpoints and private links, and that's really the traditional way of doing it. And Microsoft now recommends having conditional access and on Enter ID as the main way of securing your fabric. But I think it goes hand in hand, hand in hand with the traditional way of securing workloads, which is through private endpoints. Before we dive deep into private endpoints and private links for Fabric, I want to briefly touch upon what exactly are public endpoints and private endpoints. Right? We'll also talk about service endpoints, the hybrid in between, and then we go straight into the different aspects of security for Microsoft Fabric. For any service, really, you look at the outbound and the inbound aspect. So we'll talk about both of them, and then finally, of course, if time permits, I'd like to share a quick demo of what I've set up on Azure, and yeah, I'll take you all over. Okay, so what is Microsoft Fabric? So I'm pretty sure that a lot of the data professionals have heard of Azure Synapse, Azure Data Factory, Data Lake Storage, right? And the corresponding AWS versions as well. But Microsoft Fabric is this all-in-one end-to-end data analytics platform that has all of these aspects in it, right? Data engineering, data warehouse, data science. So it's a software as a service that now holds all of the platform as services together, right? It's like a unified platform. And if you haven't worked with Fabric yet, you have to try it. It's pretty straightforward setup, lovely UI. It's very user friendly. It's integrated very nicely, and it's quite seamless. And I'm not a very data person. I'm a more infrastructure. I'm an infrastructure guy, but hey, Fabric has been an amazing experience for me. All right, so now let's look into the traditional ways of securing workloads in Azure, right? So I'm sure all of you security gurus right now listening to this would be thinking, yeah, I want all of my public facing applications or servers in front of a firewall, right? Or a NAT gateway. You want to make sure that anything that goes in and out is checked by a firewall. You want to stop access to malicious sites. You want to make sure that known malicious IPs are blocked at your door, right? You want to have like a NAT gateway to efficiently use public IPs. As we all know, they're exhausted, right? You might even want a load balancer. So these are the first few aspects of securing workloads, right? But then you also think about, okay, how do we set up a separate hub, right? A hub and spoke to within the hub and spoke topology best practice. How do you set up a hub that hosts your firewall, your DNS, your gateway to connect, different remote sites or the on-prem to Azure, right? And also, like one of the most important aspects is how do I make sure that the sensitive data that my organization generates or holds is protected from cybersecurity threats, right? So sensitive data workloads like payment, like the PCI data, and credits, HIPAA data, right? PII data, personally identifiable information. You don't want any of these to get in the wrong hands, and if you do, you could be the organization has a big liability there, right? A lot to lose. So setting up all of these storage accounts or blobs or SQL servers, databases, tables, all of these behind a private network is of utmost importance, right? And that's the first thing that comes to your mind. So, and of course, not the least for sure is zero trust principles. Now, this is really important because we want to be able to ensure that whoever touches the data. So all this while we've been talking about securing it from a network aspect, but also from an identity and access management perspective, you want to make sure that any user, any device that accesses these sensitive data stores or data sources are authenticated by the identity provider, right? So on Azure, Entra ID is the identity provider, and we're talking about MFA and conditional access to block, known malicious IPs, certain countries of origin, and even whitelisting certain devices that are known to the tenant. So these are the traditional ways of securing workloads in Azure. Now, let's talk about a little bit before we get into the traditional ways of securing Fabric. Let's just talk a little bit about public IPs, public endpoints, private endpoints, service endpoints, right? So by default, Azure services are all designed to have access to the internet, right? So if you spin up a virtual machine, and even the virtual network, when you spin up a VNet, you get a basic NSG, a network security group that has allow outbound, right? So you have access to the internet, but access to the Azure VM is denied by default, right? So that's good. But they still have public IPs, right? So when you create a VM with the default configuration, it has a public IP and it has a private IP that it picks up from the virtual network that you have specified during the configuration build. Similarly, Azure PaaS services, so platform as a service resources like storage accounts, SQL servers and DBs, data factories, Synapse, all of them also have public IPs. They're globally available resources, right? So this very standard, you set up a VM, so you have a storage account. If the VM has a public IP, it's going to be able to pull anything from the storage account, given the fact that the storage account is enabled to public access. But this is not something that you want to do, right? Because like I mentioned earlier, you have PCI data, you have PII data, you don't want to lose them, right? You don't want to have to put them or endanger them or just hand it over to the cybersecurity threats or malicious users. So Azure has a solution called service endpoints, which is sort of like an in-between, wherein the VM is now using its private IP, so it's technically moving from within the Microsoft backbone. So Microsoft does have a robust security infrastructure in place. So it definitely makes sure that the data is being called in a very secure fashion. But hey, it's still moving over a public network, right? Like there's still that itchiness for me as a infrastructure architect. So the solution to that is actually a private endpoint. So private endpoints are essentially where the now the VM, just like in the service endpoint, still is using its private IP, so it's going through the Azure backbone, but it also is directly talking to another private IP, so a network interface card which has a private IP associated to it, and that NIC is now attached to the globally available PaaS service. So, which now makes it not globally available, right? So the storage account, the SQL server, the database, all of them, well, not the database, the server, right? The data factory or the Synapse, they all have a private endpoint now. They have a private NIC. So the the traffic flow when you run an NS lookup or a trace route, you see that traffic moves from the VM directly to that private IP. So essentially, you make that storage account as a part of your own private network, right? Nothing else can access that except for the devices within the private network. So that's really what the gist of public versus private, why we need them, and how do they work, right? Okay, so now we've come to the more interesting aspects. I'm sure you guys have been getting bored, but hey, I'm going to show you some cool stuff with Fabric, because public endpoints, private endpoints, everyone knows that, right? So, all right. So Fabric, or like any service, has, from a security perspective, you're really thinking about it in two ways, right? So one is outbound security. How does the service, so how does Fabric access the data sources, right? What is that communication? Now, there are many ways to do it. So one of them is trusted workspace access, which we're going to talk about, managed private endpoints, which is also something we're going to talk about, managed VNets, and the on-prem data gateway. So I've specifically used the trusted workspace access and managed private endpoints on multiple locations, so I really want to speak to them. And yeah, watch out for my next video. I'll probably be doing managed VNets and on-prem data gateway as well. So trusted workspace access, as you can see from the table, is really about creating a secure line from the Fabric workspace to your data source. And in our example, in our demo, the setup that I've done, it's a storage account. We're using a ADLS, right? Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2. It uses the RBAC model, of course. So we're gonna be needing a role-based access control role to make sure that Fabric's workspace identity can access the storage account. There's no particular network isolation, as is clear. It's really still over the public network, right? But it's still more secure than just publicly accessing it, right? Yeah, so it's within a trusted environment. It uses Entra ID, and yeah, we're gonna see how this works. Okay, so I'm going to be having a lot of screenshots that show you what I've built on Azure. If time permits, I'll even walk through a little bit on Azure, but really this is just leading to the main points of how it works, right? So trusted workspace access, an extremely important point to any brave tester out there or architect out there. You need an organizational account to create Fabric capacity, right, and sign up for Fabric. Now, I know that Microsoft has mentioned this in their documentation. I just went ahead and started doing it because, hey, I've been doing this for a few years now. I thought I can do this. But yeah, I had roadblock from the moment I started, right? And turns out that, so SID the AZ140 Learning SSW, is a Microsoft account, my personal account. But I couldn't sign up for Fabric and I couldn't create a capacity on Azure with that account. So I circumvented this by creating a new account called Fabric Security User. So yay, we're the secure Fabric user. As you can see, the user principal has a different identity and a type of identity. And through that user, I was able to create the Fabric capacity, sign up for Fabric, and then do the whole test that you're going to see. Another important note. So the Fabric capacity that we just made, we need to make sure that it's linked. The capacity is linked to the workspace. So when you create a workspace, you have the opportunity to choose. Well, actually, it's after the workspace creation. You have the opportunity to choose what license capacity needs to be used. So you have, like, I think, Pro, Premium, Power BI user, and so on. But we use the Fabric capacity because we want to use Microsoft Fabric's capabilities here, right? So as you can see, I've selected a SKU of F2, region Canada Central. Now I think the P SKUs are being deprecated, and the FQs, as you can see in the table, they really have everything that we need, right? So we want to manage private endpoints, trusted workspace access. If we want Copilot and AI skills and Power BI items, we need F64 or more, and F64 is 11K per month. So yeah, do not try that at home. All right, so outbound security from a workspace identity for Microsoft Fabric. Let's talk about what exactly is a workspace identity, right? Now, I'm sure all of you are aware of what service principals are or service accounts are. They're sort of used interchangeably, but really what they are is that it's an application, a non-human application that helps you meet non-human interactions, right? You don't need a human to interfere or interact. You get the service principal to act on your behalf, and what the workspace identity does is the moment you create it on Fabric. So the second screenshot is the workspace settings on Fabric. The moment you create it, you essentially get a service principal with the necessary roles on Entra. So the top screenshot is actually Microsoft Entra, right? My Entra ID for my tenant, and the festive text security is the service principal that is created works on behalf of the workspace identity. Right, so we have a non-human entity now that is going to be doing that, essentially talks to the other resource, right? And you'll see how that works. Of course, the admin needs to create this, right? So the Fabric tenant admin needs to create the workspace identity. I am the admin of my tenant, so I was able to create it without any issues. If you face any issues, just get your admin to do it. Yeah. All right, so the next part of the setup is that we need something called a resource instance rule, right? Now, the resource instance rule is something that essentially creates, like I mentioned, the secure line between Fabric and the data source. In this case, our data source is the storage account. Um, so the reason why we need this is because Fabric is, as I mentioned earlier, a SaaS, right, a software as a service. So it's identified by its URL. And if you really think about it, there's no way to lock it down, right, other than private endpoints. But this is not about private endpoints. We're not there yet, right? We're still talking about another way to do it. So we want a way to let the data source, the storage account, know that, hey, this workspace, this Fabric workspace is a trusted workspace. I know this, or I made this, right? Or it's part of my organization. So accept any requests coming from this workspace. So that's what the resource instance rule does for you. So for example, and quick note here, you can only make it at this point through ARM templates, Azure Resource Manager templates. Um, it's pretty straightforward though. It's a very small template. It's, as you can see in the screenshot, the storage account. You got to give the storage account name. You can pick up the ID from the JSON view or from the storage account within the portal. The location, the kind. So you can see that for my ARM template, and you have to also give your tenant ID, right? And then the resource ID is basically the ID of the Fabric workspace. So as we'll see, the Fabric workspace is really like a ID. The Fabric workspace ID is a alphanumeric value that's there on the URL once you log in, and I'll show you that, or you'll see it. Okay, now once we run the ARM template, and by the way, I run the ARM template using the deploy a custom editor option on Azure. It's pretty straightforward. You just search for custom template on Azure's global search, and it gives you this very nice UI, and you just upload the ARM template file, and you're good to go. So once you do that, you also need to make sure that you've set the firewall rule correctly on the storage, right? So if you see, the storage has 3 firewall rule options. So enable from all networks, which is a wide open, hey, I'll accept requests from anyone, right? Which keeps all of your data open for attack. So definitely not a good option. Only recommended for sandbox or dev data. Enable from selected virtual networks and IP addresses, right? So this is where we start to reduce the surface area for attacks. So for instance, I've added whitelisted my PC, my laptop IP, right, my public IP, and if I go to, let's say, a cafe, or if I go to the office, or if I go somewhere else, and if I'm working on Azure, I would need to whitelist that IP, right? The public IP changes. So that's really what the second option is about. But the second option is what allows us to set up the resource instance rule. So you'll see that in the second screenshot, we have the resource instance rule, which says specify which resource instances will have access to your storage account, right? And you'll notice that the resource type. So this is after I run the ARM template successfully, I get this entry that says Microsoft.fabric/workspaces, and then the instance name, right? So it's clear that now we've created a sort of a secure line between the Fabric workspace, and 691A7, the alphanumeric, is the workspace ID that I have on Fabric, which I'll show you guys. And then finally, I also need to have an exception, right? I need to allow Azure services on the trusted services list to access the storage account, right? Without that check, I won't be able to proceed. Okay, and then another aspect. So we've talked about how Fabric uses a secure line. We've spoken about the workspace identity. So, and the workspace identity is basically creates a service principal on Azure, which is like an app registration, right? And then that service principal is the non-human entity that needs to do the handshake, right? It needs to um, take the request, go to the storage account, and say, "Hey, I need to open your folders, or open your containers." But the workspace identity or the service principal, it doesn't have the role to do that, because on a storage account you need a specific role-based access control role, or back role, called storage blob data contributor, right? So without the minimum storage blob data contributor role, you won't be able to, or rather Fabric won't be able to open the container, right? So this is also Azure's amazing way of really ensuring, that we keep in, or we adhere to the zero trust principles, right? Like any action between any service, non-human or human, has to be authenticated, right? Which is amazing. So you'll see that the storage blob data contributor role is assigned to the Fabric security user. So that's essentially the user account. So my user account is going to be doing it, right? So that's about it. So once we give this role, we are good to go. So now we get on to Fabric, right? So now we get on to Fabric. So now we've finished the setup on Azure, and we log into Fabric. So app.fabric.microsoft.com. We use the Fabric security user service user principal to get in. And then yeah, we go to data engineering. So the usual lakehouse, create your own lakehouse. Um, it's pretty fun, honestly, Fabric. But yeah, let's get into the lakehouse. So I have a lakehouse called Fab Festive Tech, right? And I'm trying to create a new shortcut within under files. All right, since I have a CSV file that just has a few entries for as a sample data, right? So I move into the next step, which is which file do we want it from, which source do you want it from, right? So what are the sources that you want? So they give you the options of S3, S3 compatible, Google Cloud is there. Sorry, Google Cloud, you got cut from the screenshot. But yeah, ADLS is there for you, right? So I selected the data lake storage Gen 2, and it asks you to create a new connection for the first time, right? So the first time you're creating a connection between Fabric and your storage account, it's going to say create a new connection, and it's pretty straightforward. You just really need the URL. So storage account URL is just HTTPS colon double forward slash the storage account name, right, .dfs.co.windows.net, and you could also give the exact file path that you want, right? So you can just give the storage account URL, and you should be good, right? And then you create a new connection, you give a connection name. So I just give it connection, that's the default. And there are different authentication types, right? So organization account is quite, I'd say, the standard, because again, this is using Enter ID, right? So I'm sure any security guru out there would be happy to hear me say that, hey, I'm essentially using my single source of truth as Enter ID for all of my operations, right? So even the workspace ID service principal is using Enter ID and RBAC roles, and then when I'm creating the connection, I'm still getting authenticated as through Enter ID, right? So my Fabric security user, so you can see that's the name of the service, that's the name of the user principal, Fabric sec user at AC140. So that's really it, right? So you can potentially use access keys, you can use service principals, you can create a whole new service principal and do that. You can even say manage entities, but really this is perfect using Enter ID, and Microsoft recommends it. So I didn't have to make a change, right? It automatically says let's authenticate using organizational account, which is what we highly recommend, and Microsoft recommends too. So I've just filled it in here. So as you can see, my storage account name is called stfab sec user cc01. Good naming, like storage account, Fab security user, Canada Central 01. And then yeah, I'm successful, right? Of course, because I've already set up that trusted workspace access. So it asks me to choose, right? So you can choose the directory. So if at this point I just have one directory, so it's picking up the one that I have. It's able to see that I have one CSV file, which is also called fabsec user. Yep, it's created. So you can see now that under files we have one shortcut called fabsec user info.csv, right? I mean the shortcut is, well, that's the name of the document, but yeah. And yes, finally, you can preview the data, right? So I think most data types are supported, but yeah, CSV, I just picked the most common one that I know of, or I hear all of my data colleagues talking about. But yeah, So you can see his name, age, sex, my name, my age, my sex. But yeah, essentially this is how I can secure from an outbound perspective Fabric to the data lake, right, to the data storage. Now, I just wanted to give you guys a quick view of what would happen if, let's say, we had a malicious user, right? Let's say we had a user who is disgruntled with the organization that he works for. He's like, you know what? I'm gonna pull some data and do some ETL loops, or cost. I want to cost the organization some money and then leave, right? Hey, guess what? Let's also assume that he's been identified as someone who doesn't need to use the trusted workspace, because he doesn't have any work there, but he gets in a Fabric, he creates his own workspace. Let's call it malicious workspace user, as I've called it, and he tries to create a connection. So because it's the second person trying to create the connection, now you can see that there are options to choose existing connections. So he gets the easy way of just selecting the existing one, but guess what? He can't do it. He can't do it because his workspace. So I'm gonna go back here and see the highlight over here that says BD459. Right, that's a different workspace, right? So his workspace is not trusted by the storage account, and he's not authorized to do it. So there you go. That's one way of. Well, of course, this means that you need to make sure that only trusted users are on the trusted workspace, and that's sort of the idea, right? That you have, what users are you're using what workload, right? And on Fabric workspaces is really what lets you do all of your activities, right? Build your lake house, or I think create your Spark notebooks and so on. All right, so the second part of outbound security is managed private endpoints, right? So all this time we talked about the second option of the storage account, which is enabled from selected virtual networks and IP addresses. But that, like I mentioned, that still sort of doesn't fully narrow down the surface area of threats. So managed private endpoints help you do that, right? So essentially, a managed private endpoint is a private endpoint that is managed for you by Azure, right? You don't Once you create it, they take care of all of the network aspects. They make sure it's part of your private network, right? So managed private endpoints are created from the Fabric workspace. So it's per workspace. So for instance, the managed private endpoint for one workspace doesn't really get used for another workspace. So it's the same way the malicious user cannot use that managed private endpoint. And yeah, it's pretty straightforward. You go to the settings and you try to go to network settings, and you can spin up your own managed private endpoint, right? So as you can see, I started creating a test managed private endpoint, test MPE. It's under provisioning. So there's a approval aspect over here. So it also adds some sort of securities that only the owner of the resource can even approve this, right? So the approval process actually happens on Azure, so which we'll see right now. But essentially, what happens is that you're requesting a private link to be created between Fabric workspace to the data source, right? In this case, storage account. So over here, if you notice, you'll see that the private endpoint connections. So in the previous section, we saw something about firewall and virtual networks for the storage account, right? Next to that was private endpoint connections. So this is actually a connection that's being requested by Fabric, and once you approve it, it gets approved on Fabric as well. And then what we can do is we actually verify, right? So we want to make sure that we're not just doing this and leaving it there, right? We verify by disabling public network access. So now we've disabled public network access, right? And voila, you can see that it didn't let me rename the shortcut while I was making it, so I left it at that. But the _1 is a new shortcut made with disabled network access, right? Public network access. So that's really how managed private endpoints works. Pretty straightforward, pretty simple, to be honest. And of course, the malicious user cannot use it because he or she is not part of the workspace, right? So again, it's all to do. It's like your workspace is where you control your security, right? Okay, now moving on to the inbound security aspects. So we've been talking about how Fabric how do we secure Fabric connecting to our data sources? And we saw that you can use a trusted workspace and a resource instance rule to make sure that one workspace can securely communicate with a data source, like a storage account. And then we also saw how we can make sure that we're not leaving the surface area of our attack higher or bigger on this data side, on the data source side, by using managed private endpoints. So when we use managed private endpoints, we can disable public network access altogether and still communicate from Fabric to the data source. But we haven't been talking about the inbound security, right? So that's where we are at now. Inbound security in this context means how can we secure the data that's going to Fabric, right? Or accessing Fabric. So how do users use Fabric? Or how does data from the internet, how is that protected, or how is that regulated or secure, right? So the traditional way, so as I mentioned earlier, a lot of you data folks know and have used Azure Data Factory, Azure Synapse Workspace, Data Lake Storage, Azure Key Vault. All of these PaaS services, the best way to secure them is private endpoints, right? Private endpoints and private links. There are different private endpoints for each service. For example, the storage account, Data Lake Storage requires 3 private endpoints. One for Blob and DFS, right? And then Data Factory has 2. The Synapse has 3, right? One for the SQL on-demand pools, the SQL pools, and for the UI itself. Even Azure Databricks has private endpoints. So really any PaaS service, the traditional way of locking them down is private links and private endpoints. Now, why do we do that though, right? So the biggest advantage, like I mentioned earlier, is that you're now making sure that that service is part of your private network, right? It's like an arm that has suddenly been connected to you. So you get private IPs, so it's part of your private network. You can even connect them to on-prem. So now this makes it easier to access the, not just easier, secure as well, right? If you're a user on-prem and you want to access a Azure Synapse Data Analytics workspace, but you're scared of where the data is going, right? If left enabled to all networks, sure, it's going to be all over the place. But if it's private, if it's behind a private endpoint, and then if that's connected to your hub using a DNS private resolver, and if that hub is connected to your on-prem using a site-to-site VPN, an IPsec tunnel, or even an express route, that connection makes sure that the data is flowing through a very secure and protected path, right? So it essentially has this fully integrated feature, which I find very appealing and of a lot of use for banks, healthcare, governments, even like legal offices, right? So yeah, that's really what inbound security is about. And on Fabric, it's essentially the same thing, right? So you need to be able to create a private endpoint for Fabric's endpoints, right? The URL endpoint. So like when you go to app.fabric.microsoft.com, you don't want it to be accessed at a public IP. Right, just like you don't want the storage account to be accessed at a public IP, you don't want app.fabric.microsoft.com to be accessed at a public IP. So that's really what the concept is here, and we're going to see that. So enabling private link for Microsoft Fabric has again 2 main settings on the Fabric tenant level, right? So you want to block public internet access. So what that does really is that it makes sure that anyone who's accessing app.microsoft fabric.microsoft.com is not it cannot happen from outside of your private network, right? So you have to be within, let's say, the site-to-site VPN, and then access it through your workspace, or you need to have a jump box and a bastion host, right? The bastion host which creates the perimeter guard for you, and that's precisely what we have, right? So I don't have a site-to-site VPN to my hub network on Azure, but I have set up a Jumpbox virtual machine and a Bastion host, which we will see. And the second setting is actually the one below, called Azure Private Link, right? Which essentially allows you to create that private link for Power BI service. So it's still called private link for Power BI service now, as we'll see. But without this setting, you can't actually create that private endpoint. So you really need both of these to have a fully truly secure Microsoft Fabric tenant in the traditional fashion, right? And just to be clear, the newer or the non-traditional fashion is technically the Enter ID conditional access. So because Fabric is a SaaS, Enter ID conditional access would be the the main way of securing Fabric. But the traditional way, like how you do it for PaaS services, is private link. So that's really the intent of this. Yeah. Okay. Now, the inbound security for Microsoft Fabric is really about, you start off by setting up like I mentioned, the private link service for Power BI, right? So it's called private link services for Power BI because it's still, Fabric is built on top of Power BI. Correct me if I'm wrong, data folks. But yeah, essentially the ARM template. So again, just like the resource instance rule, you can't create this from the portal. It needs to be created using an ARM template. And you really just need to give like the tenant ID and the name, right? The name of the Fabric capacity or Fabric resource you have on Azure. So my resource is called Fab Festive Tech CC01. So that's pretty much the name of that resource. And yeah, you take that to you create the resource. Private link service for Power BI using the ARM template. Now, the next step is that I wanted to create, so I created a hub and spoke, right? So hub and spoke best practice topology, just to show you guys what it would feel like, in the sense that if I was on-prem, maybe my hub could be on-prem, but realistically I'd have on-prem connected to the hub, and then the hub connected to the spoke, right? But you can see that I've paired both of them. So I have the spoke VNet on the top, the hub VNet below, and I have a fully synchronized peer status, but bidirectional peer between the two, yeah. And then I create the private endpoint. So you need to create a private endpoint for the same resource, right? So for private link services for Power BI. So the ARM template is actually enabling the link, right? If you think about it from a very rudimentary perspective, it's like laying the road, and then like you have a door, right? Or like a pipe, and then you have like the opening of the pipe is actually the private endpoint, and the pipe is the private link service. So that's really what this is. It's like I'm creating the door now to access that pipe. And then of course we have the DNS. So private DNSs are always automatically created for the private endpoint resource, so that the DNS will have the records of the private IP and the respective FQDN, right? And once I'm done, I have a private endpoint, and I can see that I have, like I mentioned, IP addresses, so 10.104, 10.105, and 10.106 for the respective FQDNs, right? Now, let's look at how to move forward. How do we access it now? So now we've created a private endpoint for Fabric. We've blocked internet access, so we can't really get in. So we need to have a virtual machine and a Bastion host, right? So I've created a VM to D2 V3, if I'm not wrong. It's a standard one that Microsoft recommends. And if you notice, I don't have a public IP address, right? So I don't have a public IP, so I don't have any access to it other than going on prem. So naturally, because I don't have the site-side VPN, I'm going to be using a Bastion host. And since I created the VM, I have the admin, credentials, so I should be able to get in using Bastion. An important note is the second screenshot here is that the private DNS zones were created for the private endpoints to host their respective private IPs and FQDNs, right? Now, there's a reason why I've had to create a second VNet link. So the one below, the non-highlighted link name, the scrambled alphanumeric, is automatically created by Azure for you to connect the private DNS zone to the spoke VNet where my resource is, right? But I need it to be connected to the hub, and here's why, right? So my jump box is on the hub, correct? Imagine that if I was on prem, and I would need to connect to that jump through the jump box to my resource, which is in the spoke. But when you create a private resource in a private DNS zone, it only creates a VNet link to that specific VNet where it takes its private IP from, VNet subnet, right? So if I don't have this VNet link to the hub, then my hub VNet does not have any idea as to where that private resource is, right? The record is not visible to the DNS of the hub VNet. So that's really why we need this. It's just a simple 2-minute, 1-minute job of adding a new link. And I believe about one DNS can have links, I think 100 links. Yeah. So it's a very important note is that if you do not do this, you're not going to be able to reach your private resource. You're not going to be able to open Fabric securely. It just won't open, right? And we'll see how you can see how it resolves to the right private IP address only when I have the link. Okay, so now we have everything ready, right? So we have a jump box, we have Bastion, we have private endpoint, we have private link service. It's time to enter it's time to enter our jump box to then securely open Fabric. And voila, as you can see, when I learned on NS lookup, so when I look name server lookup for the FQDN of app.fabric.microsoft.com, it responds with the actual private link FQDN that is now associated to Fabric, and it gives me 10.1.0.6, which is pretty much the same IP address that I see as my private NIC, correct? So you can see that now what essentially I've done is that in in general, when I'm opening Fabric, I'm just opening a URI, right? I'm just opening a HTTPS or app.fabric.microsoft.com, and that can be any public IP. But now with my setup, with the jump box, with the private endpoint, with the private link service for Power BI, I am able to access it through this link, through this connection that I've created, through that pipe that I've created, right? So this is really how you traditionally lock it down, right? So you have now everything. Now your Fabric is also down from a very, I don't know if you can visualize this, but it's brought down to your private network. So if I was on-prem, and you'll see in the demo I've given a small architecture, so I'll speak to that. But if I was on-prem, I could essentially follow that path, right? On-prem to the DNS through the firewall, on-prem firewall, site-to-site VPN or express route, gateway on Azure, to the hub VNet, and then to the spoke VNet, and then open Fabric. Right. So we're here at the architecture that I wanted to speak to. So this is the outbound. So a quick refresher of what I was speaking about earlier. I have a user on the left, right, and this user is now authenticated with with MFA and conditional access, and they have the RBAC role, which is storage blob data contributor. They're going through the Bastion host now just because I already set up the Bastion host. It's not mandatory, but it is mandatory if the storage account is already blocked by traffic, by disabled from public network, right? So you go through, and then the green line is really what says that, hey, the traffic is allowed because we have the trusted workspace access with the resource instance rule. And the workspace identity, which is then creating a service principal, has that role, right? So it all works in a very smooth flow. And then of course we have the inbound piece. So we have a fictional on-prem. We don't really have an on-prem, but of course, just to visualize that when a user is connecting to directly, so the red line is interesting here because the red line is what we don't want, right? We don't want anyone to just go and try to open the lake house on Fabric, right? But that gets blocked because Fabric now knows that, hey, I have a private endpoint, I have private NICs, multiple NICs to receive trusted requests from. So I would have to go to the jump box, right? Well, if I had on-prem, I'd go to on-prem first, right? Or I'd be on-prem, and then go traverse the site-to-site VPN, and then go to the hub, get onto the jump box, right? Open the jump box, access same thing, app.fabric.microsoft.com, and you should be successful. That's it for the presentation piece. Now, I'd like to quickly move into the demo side. So, as you can see, this is Bastion. So let's quickly go into Azure. This is my Azure tenant. As you guys saw, Fabric Sec user, right? This is my resource group. So, from a best practice, from a Azure landing zone perspective, being a core architect, I got to do this to myself, right? Function, purpose, owner. So, but yeah, I have my Fabric capacity, like I'd mentioned. So it's on, SKU is F2. I have the private endpoint. I have my DNS zones. And then once again, very important is to go here and make sure you have this link to hub, right? Very important, because otherwise these record sets would not be visible, right? So this is the one that we wanted to catch, the actual application, right? Okay, and then the VM. So the VM is a D2S v3. Two vCPUs, standard Windows server, no public IP, and then yeah, I think this storage account, yeah, this is just the basic ADLS Gen 2 storage account, LRS. So right now we have it enabled, and this is the instance name, right? So this is the RI, the Azure Resource Instance. Okay, resource instance. Yeah. All right. So now let's go back to the Bastion host because I want to work off of a private network, right? Now this is my this is Fabric, right? Welcome to Microsoft Fabric, data engineering. So I have both the workspaces, right? I have the Festive Tech workspace, I have the malicious user workspace. So really what I'm doing is I'm going to the lake house, right? I want to see, so as you can see, just want to see more data. Boom. It should work. There shouldn't be any problems because I've set it up as I wanted to. All right. Now let's say that I go back to the storage account. So that's perfect because I haven't added this, right? But of course, being the owner, I can very much go ahead, add my client IP address. So I can't open this containers because you see this is another IP address I was working off another place, right? Or another device rather. So I can add my client IP address. And while that's being done, I just wanted to show you guys. So if I go back here and if I run ns lookup for fabric.microsoft.com, this is where you are. So really, if you think about it, I basically I can only now open this from this jump box, and it's always going to resolve this, and it's also picking up the answer from 168, 63, 129, 16, right? So this is the static DNS of Azure. So Microsoft has a DNS that it uses to help users or organizations do DNS resolution from outside to inside. So each VNet has its own instance of 168, 63, 129, 16, right? So yeah, and then now that I have this, I should be able to go back to the containers. Yep, perfect. I can open it. I can upload something new. I can probably just try to go here, bring up something like this, upload it. So this is another CSV file, right? So now the only reason why I can do this is because of course I have my right. I have it enabled, but I could disable it and I couldn't do it, right? That's another example which we can do. Save it. But at the same time, I should now be able to boom, there you go. So the same shortcut, right? So once you create the shortcut, you don't really need to create it again when you have an update, right? You can just have the same document. And then of course, this is just another CSV file, right? But yes, there you go. Perfect. So we have it disabled now, right? And we're still going to be able to access and view them. And that's primarily because we have something called, if I go to the workspace, go back to my Festive Tech Security workspace, workspace settings, network security. There you go. So this managed private endpoint is helping me consistently communicate with the storage account securely. Correct. And last but not the least, this is very important. So you can have pro, premium per user, trial. So I have my Fabric capacity, and I've associated with the Fabric capacity the one resource that I have. All right, folks. I hope you've enjoyed this. It's been a pleasure for me to set this up, talk about Microsoft Fabric. It's an amazing piece of technology, and I've enjoyed every moment of setting it up, and I hope that you've enjoyed it as well. Thank you.